Welcome to Unintended Consequences, Episode 41. It's June 26, 2026, closing the week with one final case study before the weekend. Eisenhower's 1956 Interstate Highway Act promised faster travel for all, yet in city after city, the new roads accelerated the emptying of urban neighborhoods instead. In June 1956, President Dwight Eisenhower signed the Federal Aid Highway Act into law. The legislation authorized 41,000 of limited access roads that planners said would finally end the traffic jams choking American cities. Within a decade, routes such as New York's Cross Bronx Expressway and Detroit's Chrysler Freeway had sliced straight through the densest blocks of Black and immigrant housing. The projects displaced tens of thousands of residents and opened direct commuter paths to newly built suburbs. The same concrete that was meant to bind the nation together instead sped the departure of middle-class households and the steady loss of city tax revenue that followed them out. Eisenhower had seen the value of Germany's Autobahns during World War II. He returned convinced that modern highways would serve both commerce and national defense by moving troops and supplies efficiently in any future conflict. The 1956 legislation, drafted with the help of his friend and former General Motors executive Charles Wilson, framed the system as a public works program that would employ thousands while cutting the cost of moving goods between farms, factories, and ports. At the time, most urban streets were still two-lane roads laid out before the automobile. So engineers calculated that adding lanes alone could not solve the problem of through traffic mixing with local deliveries and streetcars. Average downtown speeds in places like Chicago and St. Louis had fallen below 10 miles per hour during peak hours, which meant a crosstown trip that once took 15 minutes now stretched past 40. Federal and state engineers therefore treated the new interstates as a technical fix for congestion and as a way to modernize aging industrial cores without having to rebuild every local street one intersection at a time. The legislation offered 90% federal funding, a ratio that made refusal politically difficult for city halls already struggling with post-war maintenance backlogs on streets, sewers, and bridges that had seen little investment since the 1920s. Construction began almost immediately after the bill became law. In New York, Robert Moses routed the Cross Bronx Expressway through the Tremont and East Tremont sections rather than through Parkland farther north. He cited lower property acquisition costs and the presence of older tenements already labeled blighted by city housing surveys, even though those same blocks housed stable working-class families whose rents supported local shops. Detroit's planners aligned I-75 and I-2375 through Black Bottom and Paradise Valley, neighborhoods that city reports had already targeted for clearance under separate urban renewal programs, so the highway right-of-way could be assembled with fewer new eminent domain fights. Early progress reports from the Bureau of Public Roads highlighted completed rural segments that cut New York to Chicago driving time by several hours. Yet those same reports rarely tallied how many households had to relocate within the same fiscal year. Local newspapers in 1958 and 1959 carried photographs of ribbon cuttings attended by mayors who praised the jobs and the promise of new retail districts along the rights-of-way, while the transcripts of public hearings show that a handful of housing advocates, including Jane Jacobs in New York, and a small group of Black ministers in Detroit, testified that the routes would split existing communities. Their objections were recorded as minority statements in the official transcripts, which meant the formal record acknowledged the concerns without altering the alignment decisions already approved by state highway departments. Once the elevated lanes opened, daily traffic counts on the Cross Bronx climbed past 100,000 vehicles within 2 years. Most of those vehicles belonged to commuters leaving the Bronx for Westchester and Nassau counties, because the new expressway removed the stoplights and cross streets that had previously slowed the trip. Families who could qualify for Federal Housing Administration mortgages followed the new pavement outward, since the same legislation that built the highways also underwrote suburban home loans that required only a small down payment. Census tract data from 1960 to 1970 show net losses of 30% or more in the very blocks the expressway had bisected, which translated, in a neighborhood of roughly 8,000 residents, to more than 2,400 households departing within a single decade. Detroit's Black Bottom lost roughly 15,000 residents between 1950 and 1960, as the Chrysler Freeway and adjacent clearance projects removed both housing and the small businesses that had sustained them, leaving behind vacant lots whose assessed values fell to near zero. Because the highways were financed and maintained with state and federal fuel taxes rather than local property taxes, suburban jurisdictions captured the new residential growth while central cities absorbed the loss of ratables, meaning each departing household took its contribution to schools and policing with it, but left the fixed cost of maintaining the remaining streets and pipes behind. Second-order effects compounded quickly once the population numbers began to shift. Remaining urban schools saw enrollment drops that triggered state funding formulas to shift resources outward, because those formulas were calibrated to average daily attendance and therefore rewarded districts that were still adding students. Police and fire departments faced rising per capita costs on shrinking budgets, since the same number of emergency calls now had to be answered by a smaller tax base, and the visible decline in neighborhood retail corridors reinforced the perception that further departure was prudent for any family that could still obtain a mortgage. By the mid-1970s, most accounts placed the cumulative property tax shortfall in older industrial cities in the hundreds of millions of dollars annually, a gap that persisted long after the original construction dust had settled, and that forced repeated cuts to library hours, park maintenance, and street lighting. By the late 1960s, the Federal Highway Administration began requiring environmental impact statements and limited relocation assistance. Yet the basic routing logic remained unchanged in most metropolitan areas because the 90% federal share still applied and local officials continued to weigh acquisition cost above all else. Some cities later attempted partial reversal. San Francisco removed the Embarcadero Freeway after the 1989 earthquake, and Milwaukee dismantled a mile of the Park East Freeway in 2003, returning the land to taxable development that could once again appear on the city's property tax rolls. In Detroit and the Bronx, however, the structure stayed in place. Maintenance and eventual reconstruction costs now fall on the same municipalities whose tax bases were thinned decades earlier. Contemporary debates over highway removal or cap parks still encountered the same funding mismatch that favored construction in the first place, because federal dollars remain easier to obtain for new pavement than for neighborhood-scale reconnection projects that would restore the street grids the interstates had severed. Infrastructure choices that optimize for vehicle speed without pricing adjacent land use effects tend to export fiscal capacity from the places that can least afford to lose it. When acquisition costs and political resistance are allowed to dictate alignment, routes reliably follow the path of least immediate opposition, which often coincides with the neighborhoods already facing disinvestment. Decision makers today who evaluate new mobility projects solely on travel time savings or regional GDP models repeat the same narrow frame that produced these outcomes. The practical question is whether any current transportation plan assigns equal analytical weight to the tax base and demographic shifts it will set in motion 5 or 10 years after opening day. That's the case for today. The lessons tend to travel further when you share them, so send this one to someone who'd find it useful and subscribe wherever you're listening. See you tomorrow, and if you'd rather watch than listen, find us on YouTube at NARA Network, links in the show notes. And before you go, this show is part of the NARA Network, a family of daily podcasts on tech, science, and markets. Each one a short, sharp briefing you can finish on the commute. If today earned its place in your feed, here's your next listen, OmniView, a balanced daily world news briefing that takes every side seriously. Find every show free at naranetwork.com. This episode used AI voice synthesis of my voice. Editorial selection and analysis are my own.